Looking back, I should have known the divorce was just the beginning. You don't spend 23 years with someone and really know them. Not deep down. 2 years of silence. Then 3 knocks on my door just after 7 in the morning. That was when I learned what Daniel had really been planning. My name is Rachel Dixon. I'm 60 years old. For 32 years, I worked chemical processing equipment at the Hartwell Industrial Complex outside Fort Worth, Texas. It was the kind of job people only noticed when something went wrong. A good union job, steady pay, long shifts, loud machines, the kind of work that lets you raise a daughter and build a life slowly, one paycheck at a time. I retired 18 months ago with a modest pension. After decades of alarms at 4:30 in the morning and air that always smelled faintly of industrial solvents, I thought I had finally earned something simple. Peace, quiet. Instead, 2 years after my divorce from Daniel, the police showed up at my door. It was a Tuesday morning in February, 7:15 exactly. I remember because my coffee was still too hot to drink. I was standing in my kitchen in a t-shirt and jeans, mug halfway to my mouth, when I heard 3 hard knocks on the front door. Not polite knocks, the kind that announced themselves. My little rental house was quiet except for the heater clicking on and off. Through the kitchen window, I could see frost clinging to the neighbor's mailbox. Then the knocks came again. 3 sharp hits. I set my mug down and walked to the door. When I opened it, 2 detectives were standing on the porch. County sheriff badges caught the weak winter sunlight. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson's curtain shifted. Next door, Henry Wilcox suddenly looked very interested in his mailbox. Nothing travels faster in a quiet neighborhood than the sight of police at someone's door. The first detective was a woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes that looked like they'd seen every kind of lie. "Rachel Dixon?" she asked. "Yes." She reached into her coat and handed me a card. "Detective Lisa Peak." "Ms. Dixon," she said calmly, "we need to ask you about several loan applications submitted under your name over the past 18 months. For a second, I thought I had misheard her. Loan applications? The younger detective beside her, Torres, flipped open a notebook. 8 applications, he said. Amounts between $9,000 and $15,000. He looked up. Your signature appears on all of them. My coffee sat forgotten on the hall table. That's not possible, I said. I haven't applied for any loans. I'm retired. I live on my pension. Detective Peak studied my face. Approximately $48,000 total, she said. Does that amount mean anything to you? And just like that, I knew. Daniel, my ex-husband, the man who had already walked away from our marriage with more than I could afford to lose. That can't be right, I said carefully. We divorced 2 years ago. I haven't had contact with him since. The detectives exchanged a glance. Not disbelief exactly, but not trust either. Would you be willing to come down to the station tomorrow afternoon? Peak asked. 2:00. Her tone was polite, but there was weight behind it. Questions that needed answers. Questions that assumed I might already know more than I was saying. Of course, I said. Torres wrote something down. They thanked me for my time, handed me another card, and walked back toward their unmarked sedan. I stood there long after the car disappeared down the street. Across the road, Mrs. Patterson was already on the phone. The whole neighborhood had seen the police visit. I closed the door slowly. The house felt different after that, smaller somehow. Before I could move, I heard footsteps on the porch. The screen door creaked. Rachel! Frank Richardson leaned his head inside. Frank lived 2 houses down. 64 years old, retired state trooper, built like a fire hydrant, with gray hair clipped so short it still looked regulation. He had been my neighbor since I moved into the rental after the divorce. More importantly, he had been the only person who checked in when the silence got too loud. You okay? He asked. The police think someone took out loans in my name, I said. Frank stepped inside and shut the door behind him. How much? 8 loans, almost $50,000. His jaw tightened. Daniel. It wasn't a question. When's the last time you talked to him? The day everything ended, I said. 2 years ago. Frank poured coffee while I spread old paperwork across the kitchen table. Divorce decree. Asset division. Bank documents. 8 pages of legal language that boiled down to one simple fact. Daniel kept the house and $42,000 in equity. I kept my pension and my truck. Everything else had been sold, split, or signed away. Frank pointed to one section of the decree. All debts incurred by either party following execution of this decree shall be the sole responsibility of the party incurring said debt. That helps, he said, at least on paper. Then he noticed the note I had written in the margin years ago. Daniel needs SSN for final tax return, March 15th. I felt sick all over again. After I moved out, I said quietly, He called and said he needed my social security number to finish the tax paperwork for our last year together. Frank looked up. And you gave it to him? I nodded. 23 years of marriage. One phone call. That was all it took. Rachel, Frank said softly. That's how he got started. My phone buzzed on the table. Emily, my daughter. I had left her 3 messages after the detectives showed up. I answered immediately. Dad! She stopped herself. Mom, she corrected, her voice tight with embarrassment. Daniel called me this morning. My stomach turned. What did he tell you? That you're in trouble with the police. That you're trying to blame him for loans you took out. I closed my eyes for a second. That's not true. I haven't spoken to him since the divorce. He says you've been calling him, Emily said, threatening him. I haven't called him at all, I said. He's lying. Silence. Then she spoke again. He was crying, Mom. Of course he was. Daniel had always been able to cry on command. Tears had been one of his favorite tools. Never when we were alone. Only when someone else was watching. I can prove I didn't take those loans, I said. The signatures are fake. Another pause. For one brief second, I thought she might believe me. Then Emily sighed. I can't deal with this right now. I have to get back to work. She was at Harris Methodist. I could hear the clipped pace in her voice, the one she used during hospital shifts when emotions had to be shoved aside just to get through the day. Please don't call me about Daniel anymore. The line went dead. I set the phone down carefully. Frank said nothing. He simply poured another cup of coffee and slid it toward me. She chose him, I whispered. Not necessarily, Frank said. She chose the easier version. I don't have time for that, I said. The police think I stole $50,000. I have $2,000 in the bank, and my next pension check isn't due for weeks. Frank leaned forward. You need a lawyer. Who handled the divorce? Janet Reeves, I said. $250 an hour to watch Daniel walk away with half my life. Frank shrugged. Call her anyway. After he left, I sat alone at the kitchen table, listening to the neighbor's television through the wall. 2 years. Daniel had spent 2 years doing this, forging my name, using my information, setting up a version of the story where he got to be the victim and I got to be the bitter woman who couldn't let go. I stared at Janet Reeves's number saved in my phone. Then I pressed call. If Daniel thought I was going to quietly carry the blame for what he'd done, then he didn't know me nearly as well as he believed. Detective Peake's office smelled like burnt coffee and old paper. I sat across from her desk at exactly 2 o'clock the next afternoon. She made me wait 20 minutes before calling me in. Maybe it was scheduling. Maybe it was a tactic. Either way, it worked. The sheriff's office had that tired government building look. Beige walls, fluorescent lights that hummed, chairs designed to punish your back after 10 minutes. I kept thinking every person who walked past me was wondering the same thing. What did she do? Finally, a deputy opened the door. Ms. Dixon? I followed him into a small office. Detective Peake sat behind her desk, flipping through a folder thick enough to tighten my chest. She didn't smile. Thank you for coming in, Ms. Dixon. Her tone was neutral, professional, not friendly. She slid a stack of photocopied documents across the desk. Take a look. The top page was a personal loan application. $11,000. Submitted 16 months earlier to First Texas Bank. My name sat at the top. My social security number. My Hartwell employment history. My retirement information. Everything was accurate. Everything except the signature. The D in Dixon had a loop in it. I had never written my name that way in my life. That's not my signature, I said. Detective Peake folded her hands. It was close enough to fool the bank. She tapped the bottom corner of the page. See the notary stamp? A small blue seal. Rachel Perkins, Notary Public. She verified your identity and says she met with you in person. I've never met anyone named Rachel Perkins, I said. Peake leaned back and watched my face. Ms. Dixon, you're telling me you had no knowledge of nearly $50,000 borrowed in your name over the last 18 months? That's exactly what I'm telling you. I kept my voice even, though my pulse had picked up. But my ex-husband had access to my personal information. I gave him my social security number after the divorce so he could finish our final tax return. Peake reached for another document. A bank statement. Restaurants in Dallas. Department store charges. A monthly payment on a Lexus lease. You drive a Lexus, Ms. Dixon? She asked. No, I drive a 2015 Ford F-150. Paid it off years ago. She tapped one charge with her pen. $2,000. Grand Hotel. Premium spa package. You remember this weekend? No, I said. Because I hadn't been there. I pulled out my phone and checked my calendar. That weekend, I had been in San Antonio visiting my older brother after surgery. I still had parking receipts from the hospital saved in a folder at home. I can prove I wasn't even in Dallas that weekend, I said. Peake gave a small nod, but her expression didn't change. Here's what concerns me, she said. From the outside, this could look coordinated. I stared at her. Coordinated? You and your ex-husband take out loans together, she said calmly. Then, when the debt becomes unmanageable, one of you claims identity theft. The words landed hard. You think I helped him do this? I'm saying we have to consider every possibility. I sat back in my chair and forced myself not to react the way she expected. I spent 32 years working at Hartwell, I said. I retired with a clean record, a pension, and enough sense not to torch my life for a few loans. Peek watched me a moment longer. Then she slid the papers back into the folder. If you're telling the truth, help us prove it. She stood. And until we sort this out, don't leave Fort Worth without notifying us. That was it. No apology, no reassurance, just the understanding that the police still hadn't decided whether I was a victim or part of the scheme. Walking out of the sheriff's office felt like walking under a spotlight. Deputies sat at desks typing reports. A woman in the lobby filled out paperwork. Even the receptionist glanced up when I passed. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking. Frank was waiting on his porch when I pulled into the driveway. He stood as soon as he saw me. How'd it go? She thinks I'm lying, I said. Or at least she's not convinced I'm innocent. Frank nodded once. That's how investigations work. He handed me a folded sheet of paper. What's this? I asked. Property records, business filings, a few public court searches. I looked down. Over the past hour, while I'd been at the station, Frank had been pulling anything he could find through public records. There were missed payment notices tied to one of Daniel's old LLCs, a filing for a dissolved consulting business, a property tax dispute, a small civil judgment from less than a year after our divorce. Financial trouble. A lot of it. Look at the dates, Frank said. I did. Most of Daniel's public financial mess started shortly after the divorce. Around the same general period, the fraudulent loans in my name had begun. He ran out of room to borrow under his own name, Frank said quietly. So he found another one. I swallowed. That's not all, he added. I tracked down the notary address. Rachel Perkins works out of a UPS store on Henderson. You talked to her? Not yet. I'm going tomorrow. I stared down at the papers. The story was starting to take shape. Daniel drowning financially. Daniel desperate. Daniel using my information because he already knew every piece of it. And the worst part was how unsurprised I felt. Because Daniel had always been careful. Always the kind of man who made 10 moves before anyone else understood the game had started. If he'd been building this for nearly 2 years, then he probably had something else coming. I found out what it was a week later. My phone rang from an unfamiliar number while I was tightening the loose handle on a kitchen drawer. Rachel Dixon? A man asked. Yes. My name is Steve Harmon. I'm a reporter with the Fort Worth Telegraph. My grip tightened on the screwdriver. I've been following a developing financial investigation connected to Daniel Dixon, he said. Your name came up. I was hoping to get your side of the story. I have no comment, I said. But he kept talking. There's something else you should know. Daniel filed for a restraining order against you yesterday morning. The screwdriver slipped from my hand and hit the floor. A restraining order? He claims you've been harassing him. Multiple calls. Threats. He submitted records that appear to show calls from your number. My heart started pounding. Spoofed calls. Of course. Daniel wasn't just stealing money. He was building context. Evidence. A narrative he could hand to police, reporters, anyone willing to take the first version they heard and treat it like the truth. We're running a story later this week, Harmon said. If you want to comment before then, you should do it soon. The call ended. I sat down slowly on the kitchen floor. Daniel was turning me into a character. Not his ex-wife. Not the woman he betrayed. The unstable one. The bitter one. The woman harassing an innocent man because she couldn't move on. And the worst part was how easy that story was for people to believe. I stayed on the floor a long time after the call ended. The house was quiet except for the wall clock above the stove. Later this week. Not the truth. Not the investigation. Just the version Daniel wanted printed first. My phone buzzed again. Emily. This time I hesitated before answering. Mom? She said. Her voice sounded strained. Did you file something against Daniel? No, I said immediately. He filed against me. That's not what he told me. He's lying. He said you've been calling him all week. I haven't called him once. He's spoofing my number. He's trying to make me look dangerous. I could hear hospital monitors in the background, a cart rattling past, somebody paging overhead. Then Emily said quietly, I don't know what to believe anymore. That hurt more than I expected. I'm telling you the truth, I said. Daniel stole my identity. The police are investigating it. She exhaled. I can't be in the middle of this, Mom. Emily. But she had already ended the call. I stared at the phone in my hand. Daniel hadn't just gone after my finances. He had gone after the only family I had left. A few minutes later, I heard boots on the porch. Frank stepped inside without knocking. He took one look at my face and asked, "What happened?" I told him everything. The reporter, the restraining order, the fake phone records, Emily hanging up on me again. Frank listened without interrupting. When I finished, he rubbed a hand over his jaw. "He's escalating," he said. "That's exactly what it feels like." "He's shaping public opinion before the case catches up to him," Frank said. "So when investigators dig deeper, you already look like the unstable one." I nodded. The mail slot clanged open. A thick envelope slid across the floor. Certified mail. The return address was from Janet Reeves's office. My stomach tightened as I opened it. Inside was a copy of Daniel's filing for the restraining order and a short legal note advising me not to contact him under any circumstances until the matter was reviewed. Frank read over my shoulder. "He moved fast," he said. "Because he knew I'd eventually push back," I said. My bank balance was already thin. Rent, groceries, utilities, fuel. One more bad turn, and things would start breaking faster than I could hold them together. Then the phone rang again. "Caller ID, First National Bank." I answered with a sinking feeling. "Ms. Dixon, this is Karen Phillips from First National. I'm calling regarding a lien recorded against your truck." "My truck?" "Yes, ma'am. We have documentation showing a title-backed loan was issued against your 2015 Ford F-1508 months ago." For a second, I couldn't speak. "That truck has been paid off for years." There was a pause. "Our records show the loan is now delinquent. If the matter isn't resolved, repossession proceedings may begin after the review period." After the call ended, I sat down on the porch steps. That truck was more than transportation. My father and I bought it together before he died. The last big thing we ever did side by side. And Daniel had managed to turn even that into leverage. An hour later, Frank came back with another page of notes. "What now?" I asked. He handed me the paper. At the top was a name. Brett Hoffman. "Who's that?" "City councilman," Frank said. "Married, 2 kids, campaigns on family values." "And he's connected to Daniel?" Frank nodded. "Daniel's been seen around a woman named Melissa Carter. Melissa used to be involved with Hoffman. That by itself doesn't prove anything. But 6 months ago, Hoffman bought a lake house in Granbury for $340,000 in cash." I looked up. "City council salary doesn't buy that." "No," Frank said. "It doesn't." He tapped the page. "The purchase happened during the same stretch of time your fraudulent loans were active." I stared at the notes. "You think Daniel paid him? Or moved money through him?" Frank said. "Either way, Hoffman may be part of something bigger than a few fake applications." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed again. Another unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. "Ms. Dixon," a calm voice said. "This is Pastor William Garrett from Grace Community Church." I frowned. "Yes?" "I was hoping you could come speak with me tomorrow," he said. "It concerns some financial irregularities we've discovered." I sat up straighter. "What kind of irregularities?" There was a pause. Then he said the one name I had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. "Daniel." I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the same thought returned. For nearly 2 years, Daniel had been quietly building a trap around me. Loans in my name, fake phone records, a restraining order, my truck used as collateral. Whoever heard the story first would believe him. Not me. By morning, the sky over Fort Worth was a pale gray that promised rain. Frank drove me to Grace Community Church the next day. Neither of us spoke much during the drive. The church sat on a quiet corner, a modest red brick building with a white steeple and a parking lot already half full. Daniel used to come here every Sunday. He liked the image of it. The reliable man, the trustworthy neighbor, the person people felt safe giving money to. Inside the church office, Pastor William Garrett stood when we entered. He was a tall man in his 60s with tired eyes and a calm voice that made people trust him almost immediately. "Ms. Dixon," he said gently, "thank you for coming." I shook his hand. Frank remained near the doorway, arms folded. Garrett motioned for us to sit. "I'm afraid this is an uncomfortable conversation," he said. "What kind of financial irregularities?" I asked. The pastor slid a thin ledger across the desk. "Our church maintains a building fund," he explained. "Donations from members, especially our older congregation, to maintain the property and support community programs." I nodded slowly. Daniel had volunteered here after the divorce. Fundraising coordinator. He had said it helped him stay grounded. Garrett opened the ledger. "At first we noticed small discrepancies," he said. $200 here, $300 there. We assumed bookkeeping errors." He turned another page. "But when we reviewed the records more carefully, columns of numbers filled the pages. Dates, transfers, withdrawals." My eyes moved slowly down the ledger. The total at the bottom made my chest tighten. $47,000. Almost exactly the same amount as the loans taken in my name. Over roughly the past 18 months, Garrett said quietly, nearly $50,000 disappeared from the building fund. Frank leaned forward. Daniel had access to these accounts? Garrett nodded. He organized donation drives and handled several of the financial records. My mind started racing. Loans in my name. Money disappearing from the church. The timing lined up almost perfectly. Garrett opened another folder. There's more. Inside were copies of credit card applications, but the names on them were not Daniel's. They belonged to elderly church members, people who trusted the church, people who trusted him. We began receiving calls recently, Garrett said. Members asking about accounts they never opened. Frank asked quietly, how many so far? 3 confirmed, Garrett said. All seniors, all regular donors. The room felt very still. Daniel hadn't just used my identity. He had been harvesting information from people who trusted him. Garrett looked shaken. I preached about honesty from that pulpit every Sunday, he said softly, and all that time. Frank stood. We'll need copies of these records. You'll have them, Garrett said immediately, and I've already contacted Detective Peake. Hearing her name again brought a strange mix of relief and dread. The investigation was growing. The story Daniel had built around me was beginning to crack, but the truth underneath it was darker than I expected. Rain had started by the time we left the church. Frank drove slowly back toward my neighborhood. You see what this means, he said after a while. He wasn't just stealing money. He was funding something, I said. Frank nodded. Possibly that councilman, Brett Hoffman, the lake house, $340,000 in cash. It fit together too neatly to be coincidence. We had just pulled into my driveway when my phone rang. Detective Peake, I answered immediately. Ms. Dixon, she said. Her tone sounded different this time. Less skeptical. We need you to come down to the station again. Did something happen? Yes, she said. We've just finished interviewing Brett Hoffman. My pulse quickened. And? He's cooperating. Frank leaned closer, listening. Peake continued. Mr. Hoffman admitted he received money from Daniel over the past year. For what purpose? I asked. Political donations, property purchases, and silence. Rain tapped against the windshield. Daniel was moving money through Hoffman, Peake said. The loans taken in your name appear to have funded several of those transfers. I swallowed. So you believe me now? There was a brief pause. Based on the evidence we've collected, Peake said, you are no longer considered a suspect. For the first time in weeks, I breathed normally. But she wasn't finished. We're preparing an arrest warrant for Daniel. What charges? Identity theft, fraud, embezzlement, possibly elder abuse related to the church victims. I closed my eyes briefly. For a moment, I pictured Daniel, the day we separated, standing in the doorway of our old house. Calm, confident, certain he had already won. What about Brett Hoffman? Frank asked quietly. Peake must have heard him. He's facing conspiracy charges, she said. He's agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. Rain continued tapping against the glass. For 2 years, Daniel had been building a web of lies, and now every thread of it was starting to unravel. Before hanging up, Detective Peake added one more sentence. Ms. Dixon, you may want to prepare yourself. For what? When we searched Daniel's house this morning, she said, we found evidence suggesting he was planning to leave the country. My stomach dropped. How soon? Very soon. The rain didn't stop that afternoon. It streaked down the windshield in thin silver lines as Frank drove me back from the sheriff's office later that day. Everything felt strangely quiet. Daniel had been preparing to disappear. For nearly 2 years, he had drained money through loans in my name, taken smaller amounts from the church, and manipulated the people around him. And when the pressure began to close in, he was planning to vanish. Costa Rica, Detective Peake later told us. Fake passports, offshore accounts, an exit plan. You ever really know someone? I asked quietly. Frank glanced at me. Sometimes, he said. Sometimes you just think you do. When we reached my street, a sheriff's cruiser was parked nearby. Detective Peake stepped forward when she saw us. Ms. Dixon, she said, we thought you'd want to hear this in person. Frank and I stood silently as she spoke. We arrested Daniel early this morning. Packing? I asked. Peake nodded. 2 suitcases, cash, passports under different names. She opened a folder and showed us photographs from the search of Daniel's house. The first image made my stomach tighten. Stacks of my mail on his kitchen table. Bank statements. Pension letters. Official documents addressed to me. All opened. All organized. Peake slid another photograph across. A binder labeled with my name. Loan documents. Credit applications. Daniel hadn't just stolen my identity. He had studied my life. How long? I asked quietly. About 18 months, Peake said. Frank let out a low whistle. That's planning. Peake nodded. And there's more. She handed me a printed message recovered from Daniel's phone. The text read, You deserve what you lost. I'm just collecting what you owe me. He sent that shortly after filing the restraining order, Peake said. He expected you to panic. Frank asked, "Did it work?" Yes, I admitted, but not the way he expected. Peake closed the folder. We're still building the case, but Hoffman has confirmed Daniel directed the fraud. What about the church money? I asked. Same operation, she said. Daniel used donation records to collect personal information from elderly members and open credit accounts in their names. I felt sick. He preyed on people who trusted him. Peake's expression hardened. Fraud cases like this rarely involve just one victim. Frank crossed his arms. So what happens now? Daniel will be charged with multiple counts of identity theft, fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse, Peake said. If convicted, he could face 20 years or more. For the first time since everything began, something shifted inside me. Not relief yet, but the beginning of it. 2 days later, Emily showed up at my door, still wearing hospital scrubs, eyes tired. I need to show you something, she said. We sat at the kitchen table. She opened a recording on her phone. I went to see Daniel yesterday, she said quietly. My heart skipped. You what? I told him I wanted to understand his side. And he believed you? Emily gave a small, bitter smile. He always thought I trusted him more than you. She pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room. Calm, confident. You think your mom's innocent? He said in the recording. She ruined my life. Everything she had should have been mine. Emily's voice followed. What about the loans? There was a pause. Then Daniel laughed. Rachel never even noticed. All I had to do was use the information she gave me. The recording continued. You stole from the church too, Emily said. They're old people, Daniel replied casually. They won't even realize what happened. The recording ended. The kitchen was silent. You recorded that? I asked. Emily nodded. I sent it to Detective Peake this morning. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said quietly, I'm sorry for believing him. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. The distance Daniel had tried to build between us finally began to disappear. Several months later, the trial began. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows. Church members sat together near the front. Daniel sat at the defense table in a gray suit. For the first time since all of this began, he looked nervous. The prosecution presented evidence over several days. Financial records, loan documents, church ledgers. Frank testified about the records he had uncovered. Emily played the recording she had made. Brett Hoffman described how Daniel had used him to move money through political donations and property purchases. When the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom fell silent. 6 hours later, they returned. The verdict was read slowly. Guilty on every count. Daniel was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Brett Hoffman received 5 years for conspiracy. As the bailiff led Daniel away in handcuffs, he turned once and looked at me. For the first time in 23 years, I saw fear in his eyes. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. And strangely, I felt nothing. No triumph, no rage, just the quiet sense that something long and painful had finally ended. 3 months later, I stood in the living room of my new condo. Sunlight streamed through the balcony windows. Below, a small park stretched across the block. The condo wasn't large. 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, 1 parking space. But it was mine. After the trial ended, my lawyer pursued civil claims against several banks that had approved the fraudulent loans despite obvious warning signs. Rather than fight in court, they settled. The settlement wasn't enormous, but it gave me something I hadn't had in years, a fresh start. Frank carried the last moving box inside. Where do you want this? Kitchen counter. A knock sounded at the door. Emily walked in carrying a bag of sandwiches. Lunch delivery, she said. We sat on the floor because I still hadn't bought chairs. Emily looked different these days, more relaxed. A few weeks earlier, she had been promoted at the hospital, and she had started seeing someone new, a quiet engineer named Marcus. Mom, she said carefully, you're really okay here? I looked around the condo, the sunlight, the quiet. I think I am. Frank raised a bottle of soda. To new beginnings. Emily laughed. That sounds like a greeting card. Frank shrugged. Doesn't make it less true. Later that afternoon, Detective Peake called. They've identified 3 additional victims from the church, she said. People Daniel had targeted the same way. If you hadn't pushed back when you did, Peake added, he probably would have continued for years. After the call ended, I stepped out onto the balcony. The June sun was warm. Children were playing in the park below. Emily joined me a moment later and handed me a cold beer. For surviving, she said. I smiled slightly. For surviving. We stood quietly watching the park. Dogs chasing each other across the grass. Kids riding bicycles. People living ordinary lives. 2 years earlier, I had believed my life was finished. Daniel had tried to destroy everything I had left. My reputation, My savings, my relationship with my daughter. Instead, something unexpected happened. The truth came out, and the people who mattered stayed. I had Emily. I had a friend like Frank. And for the first time in years, I had a life that belonged entirely to me. It wasn't the life I once planned. But standing there in the sunlight, watching the world move forward below my balcony, I realized something. Sometimes the life you rebuild after everything falls apart turns out stronger than the one you lost.